Well, my next guest has a few thoughts on how to ease the housing affordability crisis. Economist John Daly from the Grattan Institute spoke today at the National Press Club. He believes tax policies like negative gearing are certainly adding to the problem, but getting rid of them is not the only answer. John Daly joins us now in our Melbourne studio. Thanks for being there.
Good evening.
Now, do our legislators live in such a bubble of entitlement? It's becoming impossible for them to understand just how hard it is for ordinary people to buy a house.
There's certainly an issue when people live in an area and the only people who live around them are on similar incomes and have similar concerns, and then you do forget, as they say, how the other half live. Ironically, politicians probably do that less than many other people in Australia. Inherently, our politicians come from all of the areas of Australia. They're very well distributed. Some of those are rich, some of those are poor. Actually, if you were to pick a sample of politicians, a reasonable number of them do understand how the other half live. And that's actually different than most of the population, where we're seeing this big divide opening up in our cities, particularly in our big cities, between essentially a rich inner and middle ring and a relatively poor and less well-educated outer ring.
Well, Glenn Stevens, the Reserve Bank governor, says it's crazy what's happening to housing in Sydney. He's acutely aware, he's acutely concerned, he says. So do you understand why both the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, both of them Sydney-siders, don't seem to think this is a problem?
It seems to me pretty obvious that there's a problem. I wouldn't presume to give the Governor advice as to whether or not Australian prices are overvalued. But what we can say is that we've got this big gap between the middle and outer parts of our cities. We can see that housing affordability is falling in the sense that fewer and fewer younger people are able to buy houses. And by younger, I include people 35 to 44. They are less likely to own houses than people of that age 20 years ago, and particularly for those on lower incomes. We used to be a country in which those on low incomes had a pretty good chance of owning a house. Home ownership rates, however, for those on low incomes have fallen like a stone over the last 20 years.
What do you think Glenn Stevens is particularly worried about, though? I mean, is it likely that Sydney is now in the grip of a dangerous housing bubble, and does that make it inevitable that it will burst at some point?
Well, if it is in a bubble, then it is inevitable that it will burst. As I said, I wouldn't presume to give advice to the Governor of the Reserve Bank about whether Australian property prices are overvalued. I think what perhaps he was talking about in terms of social problems are those things I was alluding to. It is not good to have a society in which we see home ownership rates fall. It's not good to have a society in which particularly the poor are increasingly locked out of owning their own home, because there's a whole series of benefits to home ownership. It encourages savings, it encourages people to make their house into a home, it encourages them to build deep roots into their community. A whole series of reasons why that's a good thing. And we'd also rather have cities that weren't segregated, cities where people do live next door to people who have quite different circumstances to them, and consequently they have we wind up with a more inclusive society in which more people understand how other people in their society live and the challenges they face.
When it comes to the politics of this, I know you only observe it, but I'm sure you've got an opinion. Do you think the government's making a calculation here that there are more people, there are more voters who own properties, whose values of properties are going up, than there are people who can't get into the market, voters who can't get into the market? Is it a winners versus losers political equation here?
Well, very famously, I think it was John Howard once remarked that no one ever complained to him about their house price going up. And clearly that's a big political driver of the current circumstances. But I think there's something else going on here, which is that increasingly people from all walks of life are saying, well, I might have been able to buy a house, but my children can't. And I think that's why this has become much more of a social issue than it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. When it gets to the point that large numbers of people are saying, my child can't afford to buy a house, I can't see how they would ever get into the property market, I'm concerned that they will actually be less well off than I am, then the political calculus of this changes. The mere fact that I own a house doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to keep voting for this system in which my children might be worse off than I was.
Now, you were part of the Press Club debate today on housing affordability, and you argued that the combination of negative gearing and John Howard's cuts to capital gains tax in the year 2000 together fuel the housing crisis that we're seeing now, or the housing affordability crisis. Can you tell us how that happens?
Well, it's certainly one of the things that's going on. And the issue is this, that you can go, you buy a house to invest in it. You claim the cost of interest that you pay to the bank for the loan. As a result of that, you make an operating loss in each year. The interest is more than whatever you're getting in rent. And you claim that interest as a deduction against your marginal rate of tax. Let's say you're a reasonably high income earner. You claim that deduction at 49 cents in the dollar. But when you come to sell the house, and you make a capital gain on it, because the capital gains are now discounted by 50%, you're only going to pay tax at 24 cents in the dollar. So you've got this mismatch between the rate at which you claim the deduction and the rate at which you've ultimately paid tax that deduction essentially went to paying for. And that's one of the things that's made it so attractive. And indeed, we can see that rates of negative gearing really lifted quite materially from 2000 and onwards. And we now have in the order of 1.3 million households in Australia, 1.3 million taxpayers who are negatively gearing properties and claiming a deduction on their tax.
So they become a pretty significant lobby in this equation, if you think about it, don't they? Unless you're right and some of those people are thinking, oh, well, my kids can't get into the housing market. But Judith Sloan, the economist, during the debate, made the point that negative gearing's been around since 1915 and it didn't cause a housing affordability crisis then. Is it only the addition of this tax incentive from the capital gains tax cut that has caused this to happen?
Well, I think that the change in capital gains tax rules from indexing it to allowing you to claim essentially only pay 50% of the tax certainly has driven it along. I think there's other bigger things going on as well. We're seeing an older generation that has quite a lot of assets that's benefited from a combination of quite generous tax and welfare treatment and has also been in the right place at the right time as interest rates came down and therefore asset prices rose. And we have a quite wealthy older generation, indeed an older generation that's much more wealthy today than people of that age, say, 20 years ago. And that's the generation that's got money now to invest in investor housing. Conversely, the younger generation, particularly those, say, 25 to 34, have actually less wealth than 25 to 34-year-olds 8 years ago. And that shift in wealth towards an older generation is effectively also resulting in a shift away from young people owning houses to occupy them towards an older generation owning houses to rent them back to that younger generation.
Well, we know that the Labor Party, the Labor opposition, is thinking about changing negative gearing, thinking about it, I might add, but not retrospectively. And importantly, they may well keep it in place for new dwellings. Would that sort of change make a significant difference to the affordability crisis?
It'll certainly make some change. Of course, you've got to be very careful about the implementation of these things and the transitional arrangements. One option is to grandfather it so that anyone who's already bought a property gets to keep those tax benefits. Ironically, of course, that makes this shift of tax benefits towards an older generation even worse as they kind of pull up the drawbridge behind them. And it also could well lead to a freezing up of the property market because people who've already bought houses and have them in this tax arrangement will be very reluctant to sell them. We'd suggest a much better way of going about things is to bring it down gradually. So this year you can claim 100% of the tax deduction, next year 85%, and so on. That'll certainly help housing affordability, but it's not the really big lever. The really big lever, as indeed the Treasurer himself suggested this morning, is around the supply of housing. And the big issue is that although we've been building lots of apartments in the centre of our cities, and lots of detached houses on the edges of our cities, there's a very big pent-up demand for medium density housing in the middle rings of our cities, and our planning legislation often makes it very difficult for existing houses to be converted into medium density housing, which obviously provides more housing for more people.
A final quick question. We haven't got much time left, but what about the argument with the negative gearing issue? What about the argument that if you tamper with it, change it in any way, suddenly rents will start to spiral? There's a history of this.
Look, I think this is just a myth, and it is high time that we dealt with it. One, as a matter of economic theory, if you change the after-tax return in this way on what's essentially a more or less fixed stock of assets, you would expect that that will result in lower prices than otherwise, but no change in rents. And secondly, we've already conducted this experiment back in 85 to 87 when negative gearing came off. And yes, rents went up in Sydney and Perth, but you could see from the data that there had been a shortage of housing beforehand. Rents in real terms didn't move in Melbourne, in Adelaide and in Brisbane, which suggests very strongly that it's unlikely that a change to negative gearing arrangements will change the rents that Australians pay.
John Daly, good to see you again. Thanks for coming on to talk to us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.